cover.
Oh, sure, yes.
Because we might have questions that you might want to respond to or correct if anyone has any. So please,
Occupational hazard.
I'll invite the panelists up to the front and please stay.
Okay.
Natasha, I'll let you go first and then Atta, and then
Thank you so much, Professor Clarke, for being here and for sharing your work with us in person. It's such a treat. I know it's my job as a literary scholar to think critically, but I just want to come out and say that I'm an avid fan, and I'm absolutely honored to be here talking with you. And thank you, Eli, for including me in this panel, and to all who showed up here today. So one thing that I find so compelling about your work, Professor Clarke, is how it seamlessly blends the personal and political, canonical and non-canonical, distant and local, historical and contemporary. Your poetry collapses time, and in so doing underlines the fact that anti-Black violence is timeless. You wrote about your cousins George and Rufus Hamilton in execution poems, and there's a sense that you're deeply connected to them and are separated by a thin and porous boundary, not just in time but in circumstance. There's a sense that you could have acted as they did had you been born in the same time and place. And so Execution Poems is radically empathetic. It expresses radical empathy for Black men. To quote a recent Roxane Gay tweet, it is expansive in allowing them humanity. And I really like that term, expansive. I think that's part of what you do so effectively. Your work is expansive. It carves out a pro-Black space within the deeply racist and troubled literary field of Canlit. Your work in blue execution poems and black is ethereal and also deeply material. It's about love and desire, but it's equally about pain, suffering, and trauma. The ways in which the body holds pain, both physically and psychically, intergenerationally. Your poetry doesn't let white readers look away from the atrocities that we have committed and continue to commit against Black people. It alludes to, and in so doing, pays homage to the traditional canon, but it also cries out against it and all the anti-Black violence it has enabled. In Calculated Offensive, you write, "To hell with pound, what we desire is African. Europe is so septic, it seeps poisons. Why abet the mass murderers and the famine and munitions makers? All Plato and Aristotle ever did was waste Nat Turner's time." Your writing is radical. It scorches the earth of the white literary tradition. The last lines of Calculated Offensive are, "Put Europe to the torch. All of Michelangelo's dripping syphilitic saints, all of Sappho's insipid anorexic virgins. Use the Oxford English Dictionary and the Petit Robert for kindling." This poem, like so much of your work, highlights the political nature of language and implicitly mourns all the languages that colonizers have violently stamped out. Your work teaches us how to think critically about the white Anglo tradition. In the 2018 collection Refuse, or Refuse, Canlit in Ruins, editors Hannah McGregor, Julie Rack, and Aaron Wunker write, "At the heart of Canlit as a formation is colonial violence. Since the mid-19th century, only a select few have been able to fully reap the benefits of national representativeness. And that image of Canada and Canadians has proven remarkably inflexible in its desire to contain, possess, and assimilate the other into itself, whether that other is francophone, indigenous, disabled, poor, or trans, and so on, end quote. So I have a question for you, which is, how do we move forward? Your work suggests that one way to move forward is through imagination. In execution poems, you interweave research and imagined conversations in order to give life to the dead, in order to give George and Rufus Hamilton the public voice they never had. In so doing, you make their narrative more telling. and that's a reference to one of Rufus's lines in Malignant English. You reimagine the past, you elaborate upon it in order to correct and rewrite racist narratives. I guess I'm wondering, do you agree with that? And are there other ways that we as scholars and writers can move forward? Thank you.
Wow. First of all, thank you so much for your attentiveness to my efforts to talk about race and violence and marginalization and everything else that goes right along with it. And the reflection of those violences within the Canlit canon. And I'm thinking specifically of my Nova Scotian brother. I use that term deliberately because I'm thinking of Thomas Chandler Halliburton, who was English Canada's greatest writer of the 19th century, hands down. I'm sorry, Susanna Moody. I'm sorry. You know, yes, you're important, and we thank Marta Atwood for reminding us of your importance. But really, in terms of worldwide global impact, and impact in terms of political philosophy and political opinion involving race, especially, Thomas Chandler Halliburton was supreme for the 19th century, and his works were actually translated into French and taught in France as examples of how to capture vernacular and so on, which he was very skilled at doing. So I'm taking a long time to say something very short, which is that Thomas Chandler Halliburton was a thorough racist, thorough, straight through, straight up racist, unapologetic, and used black people in his comic sketches, emphasize his comic sketches as his buffoons, as the figures of fun and amusement, to indicate to mainly white readers, of course, that you really shouldn't be all that concerned about equality or liberty for these black folks, because they are just really so ignorant and so idiotic that they could not exist without the support of caring, thoughtful, humanitarian masters, because they really require slavery to support them, to keep them going. So, and he's, I know that his stature has diminished somewhat in recent years, and I think unfairly so. I think he's still a great writer, no matter what terrible things he had to say about black people and women and so forth. But at the same time all that is true, he is an integral figure, like Thomas McCullough, another late 18th century writer out of Nova Scotia as well, who also invented or used a lot of racist stereotypes in his humor. And I think that writers like these, and I gotta mention, I'm sorry, he comes back to mind, Hugh McLennan. I'm sorry, I've got to mention Hugh McLennan as well, because, for instance, in Barometer Rising, he has a scene where, forgive me for forgetting the protagonist's name, but he has a scene where the protagonist, still hiding out, not wanting to be discovered as being back in Halifax, wanders around Bedford Basin in Halifax. And it's the 19-teens, it's during the Great War, 1916, 1917, somewhere in there. And he's wandering around Bedford Basin. Never does Hugh McLennan note that Africville exists there. It's just totally obliterated. In The Watch That Ends the Night, he has a moment in that novel where a sculptor unveils his latest modernist masterpiece, and it's sort of a figure of an explosion of some sort. The sculptor names his sculpture "Negress Having an Abortion." It's just one example. And also, Hugh McLennan, in a series of interviews he did in 1980 around the release of Voices in Time, said that he was personally opposed to interracial marriages and relationships. He was upset by seeing black men and white women together walking down Rue St. Catherine because it spelled the demise of civilization. This was the decline of civilization. It just has happened in Rome, it's happening here in Montreal, for crying out loud. It all started here. Anyway, sorry for making light of that. This is a long way of saying that, yeah, the canon has a lot of built-in prejudices of all sorts that I believe that we literary scholars should bother, and I know we are bothering more and more, to tease them out. I noticed Professor Dearson is here, and I want to thank you very much for your work on E. Pauline Johnson and collecting her writings and so forth, and I think it's another paramount way forward in terms of asking us to engage with the racialist dimensions of Canlit. So, thank you. Great paper.
I'd just like to echo Natasha and say that it's an honor to have you here. I'm not a literary scholar. I've taken a few literature classes. My background, as Dr. MacLaren mentioned, is I have a degree, undergraduate degree in Canadian Studies, and I'm currently a master's student in the Department of Education. And so I wanted to kind of look at George Elliott Clarke and his, kind of take a meta look at writers like him who are changing the landscape of Canlit and why that's important. And as a clearly African-Canadian kid growing up in Toronto, which of course is a very diverse multicultural immigrant community, when we talked about issues like Black History Month or Black history was mostly focused on the United States. As you mentioned, a lot of it is African-American. As somebody who had always had an interest in Canadian history, I wanted to see examples of people living here. My parents are immigrants from East Africa and Tanzania, and so I didn't have that history, linking back to the United States. But of course, growing up Black in Canada, there is a common experience. And so I think this kind of feeds into this internal-external view of we tend to look externally when we talk about Black issues or African issues or even any type of issues, instead of looking at the Canadian, element. We just had Holocaust Memorial Day. The 1933 Christie Piss riots was something I never learned in school. That was something I had to learn outside of school. That happened in Toronto, right? But when I went to the University of Alberta, and I took history courses there, when they talked about Black history, they talked about it in Western Canada. And so it really, the Oklahoma immigrants who came to Alberta escaping racism. And so looking at that in a kind of localized area was really interesting. I remember in English class in high school, we'd read To Kill a Mockingbird. And this was at the time that Lawrence Hill's novel Book of Negroes came out. So I went to the library and I said I wanted to read something that happened in Canada and explore the Canadian element. To Kill a Mockingbird really didn't speak to me in that way. The second point I wanted to talk about was conceptualization. I think George Elliott Clarke, looking at your background, you have political background, politicians in your family, labor leaders, people who have either had a direct or indirect influence on you that you could aspire to be something greater than maybe you thought you could be. And I'm from the Scarborough. If anyone's familiar with Toronto, I'm from Scarborough. And I always joke Scarborough's the biggest producer of non-white hockey players in the NHL. Right? Hockey is obviously seen as a traditionally white sport, but Wayne Simmons, who's of Black Nova Scotian ancestry, DeMonte Smith-Pelly, who just brought the cup back after winning with the Washington Capitals. And so these kind of examples that we see, and Viola Desmond, who is on the $10 bill, and one of the interesting things about her was, I didn't know anything about her until I took an English class, and one of the examples was about Viola Desmond, right? So seeing how English and literature can kind of poke a way through what you don't necessarily learn in history class is really interesting. And I think George Elliott Clarke's career has been, he was kind of the first one to kind of pave the way for these new voices we're seeing. Dr. MacLaren mentioned I wrote a paper on Essie Nguyen, who's now won 2 Giller Prizes, right? And these kind of new voices. When I was at U of A, I had an opportunity to meet Billy Ray Bellecourt, who is an Indigenous poet. He was the first Indigenous Rhodes Scholar in Canadian history. And these are voices that, because of people like George Elliott Clarke and your poetry, that's providing a new way of rethinking Canadian history and Canadian, the Canadian experience is kind of, it's providing an avenue that we can use our own examples within our own borders to explain global phenomena. We don't have to look to Georgia. We don't have to look to, France. We can look to Nova Scotia. We can look to Alberta. We can look to Toronto. And I think by your work and the work of others who are following in your footsteps, I think it's a much brighter future, I think, for people to, like me growing up recently, to kind of latch onto and see those experiences portrayed in a Canadian context.
Again, I'd like to reiterate how amazing it is to hear you speak every time. The first time that I heard you speak was when I was at Vancouver Island University. I believe it was 2015. I've been asked to attend for a public speaking class, in which I learned a lot about public speaking, as I'm sure we all did here today. You're phenomenal. And during that time, I believe you were in the development of your canticles, which I have with me here. And one of the things that I was most struck with was the use of authorial voice in the canticles, particularly the use of mediation, proliferation, interjection, and bracketing. And I was thinking about the way in which you're opening up these other voices to come in that are not purely national, but they're also transnational. And I'm thinking about the way in how important it is to not only focus on the Canadian context, but to reach out and look at those different bridges that people had to cross to come into Canada as well. And one of the things I was particularly struck with in the foreword was you write about, in your composition, the necessity to go to different places and write. And one of the things you explicitly mention is how you had said that you weren't going to write any poem in Toronto. And I guess I was kind of confused by that notion, especially after hearing Atta talk. And I wondered if maybe you could clarify maybe the significance of like the localization in writing and like what place meant to you. Was it something that just kind of happened accidentally, or was it intentional?
That's a great question, and thank you again so much for your attentiveness to the text. And actually, I want to go back to Larry Hill's Book of Negroes, because there's a phrase that comes up several times in the 300s, the early 300s, pages 301, 318, and 319, where Atta in the 2007 edition, paperback, HarperCollins Canada, she says thrice on those, or actually 4 times across those 3 pages, we are traveling peoples, that phrase, traveling peoples. And I don't blame Larry Hill for putting those words in her mouth, and I think the mouth of another character as well, because that's the history of the diaspora. And it's the history of the development of blues music. It's the history of the development of the early black churches, itinerant preachers, traveling men, traveling women, and how important that was. Your question is getting me off on a little tangent, but I have to touch on this, which is, in my own personal view, is that one reason why black people in our major cities and across Canada, and recently, a couple days ago, there was a report on CBC about a new study done in Halifax on stoppings of black people in particular by Halifax police, and of course happens in Toronto, where we've had a lot of controversy over carding, and in other cities as well. Ottawa comes to mind very quickly as well. Why does this constantly happen? And of course, all over North America, black people can be walking someplace, driving someplace, and find themselves suddenly accosted, sometimes with violent outcomes and deadly outcomes, and usually for themselves, by police officers of one sort or another, usually white, not always, but usually. And my way of understanding this is to realize how radical it is that black people have mobility. It's radical. The idea that you can actually, because we have to remember that in the first few hundred years of our presence in North America, our mobility was absolutely restricted. We had no mobility. We had to be on somebody's plantation or serving in somebody's home. And so, remember, we look at the history of law enforcement, formation of police departments and so forth. That all came about as slavery was declining, was about to be abolished, emancipation was about to happen in the United States. But as soon as black people got their legal freedom through abolition in the British colonies and emancipation in the United States, police forces took up the role of keeping us under surveillance, keeping us under control, making sure that we are not someplace where we shouldn't be, making sure that we are not in possession of goods we should not be in possession of, whether it's an expensive car, should not be in possession of in terms of quotation marks. In other words, the continued harassment Black people and Indigenous youth in Canada, to this day, I believe is a hallmark of the policing regimens that began under slavery. Why are you on the road at this hour of the day or night? Where are your freedom papers? Where is your master's permission letter that says that you can move from this plantation to that plantation, and so on? And we continue to live with these regimens of surveillance. Even if the rest of society has forgotten about these surveillance practices for Black people, no police force has. None of them have. Whether we're talking about Indigenous people or racialized minorities. I'm thinking of the Thunder Bay police, who've been in the news recently, in terms of their practices towards Indigenous people in that Northern Ontario city. We can think of the practice of the Saskatoon police on occasion to drive Indigenous men out in sub-zero temperatures outside the city and leave them to fend for themselves. And sometimes they don't. So this is a long way of getting back to the question of place. In a weird way, I sort of feel that's an exercise of my freedom, of my hard-won freedom to be able to go places and to be accepted in those places, present my passport and be allowed to enter that nation, and so on. And so I thought it was important, having started Canticles in Zanzibar, so there's a Tanzanian connection, in 2008. I just felt it was important to keep that up, keep that going, and keep writing the work whenever I was traveling outside Toronto. Toronto's a perfectly fine city, it's a great city. But it just became, because I started Canticles in that way, I decided I should continue to do so. That's it. One last note about travel and being traveling people and so on. I'm reminded of Duke Ellington and his practice of composing often on the train and being influenced by the rhythms of the trains. And he actually, at the height of his fame and riches, he used to transport his entire band by train all over, I'm supposing, mainly the United States. And he'd be composing in his own private car and so forth. He didn't trust airplanes, he didn't trust boats, but only had to take boats a few times. But the train was his preferred vehicle for getting around. And you know, I think of the A train. Take the A train, for instance, as an example. Of course, that's a local train in New York City up to Harlem. But being influenced by those surroundings is very important. And I think for him too, this notion of being free to go places, despite all the restrictions that sometimes befall one, about why are you here, why should you be here, and even that question, where are you from? That question, where are you from, it can be related to who's your master? What's your plantation? Who's your master? Where are you from? Why are you in my space? Why are you here? Why do I have to look at you as I'm passing you down, I'm walking down the street? Right? Shouldn't you be someplace else? One last comment in relation to that great question. Christmas Day, 2015. I'm in Ottawa. I take my daughter and her mom for Christmas brunch at the Fairmont Chateau Laurier. And as we're leaving after we've had our tea and so forth, and feeling good, we step outside, and a gentleman who happens to be, I don't know why he was standing nearby, but he was with a couple of his friends, and looked at us, and specifically at me, and he said, "Where is your slavery identification number?" Christmas Day 2015. Where is your slavery identification number? And this may strike you as all being weird. After all, it's Ottawa, it's Canada. How could these things happen? It's 2015, for crying out loud. And it's an enlightened era, in an enlightened city. And yet, there I was, rocketed back 150 years to the end of slavery in the United States, 1865 in effect, and being forced to recognize that no matter what, my personal accomplishments, attainments, whatever, achievements, it didn't really matter. That in the eyes of many, simply being racialized black meant that I was somebody's property, or my ancestors were somebody's property, and that I really did not, coming out of the Chateau Laurier, where I probably, in his imagination, probably enjoyed a good meal at a good price. This is not something that should have been available to me, given my color, my race, in quotation marks, and that I had to be reminded of my place. But anyway, So that's why I like to get out of town to work on canticles. Thank you, that was a great question.
I would like to conclude our panel by reflecting on the phrase black ink for black liberation. A great phrase. And take you through a little bit of my reading of Canticles 1. I haven't finished reading it, but it's not finished. It's actually going to, 3 or 4 more books are coming, so that's my excuse. But the poem begins this way. It begins, "There is no choice but to go down into the hell of history to find your language." The opening words of Canticles 1, 2016. And if you start to read this book, indeed, it begins with a punishing stream of horror. Images of atrocity, images of cruelty, of butchery, of mutilation, pile up in numbing succession. And, it's no exaggeration to say Greco-Roman civilization is given a dressing down. It's undressed. It's exposed as a naked procession of appalling savagery. And the reader begins to despair. What is the point of all this carnage? And then we come to the poem Alexandria, a Light, which I mentioned I admire, and you were gentleman enough to read for us this morning. And for me, this is the first really important turning point. For me in my reading experience, this was a really important turning point in this book, Canticles 1, 2016. It too is a hellish poem, as you heard. It retells the story of the siege of Alexandria in 48 BC. Julius Caesar setting fire to his own fleet in a strategic maneuver against Ptolemy and Cleopatra. The fire spreads from the ships to the harbor and into the city, destroying the Library of Alexandria, at least in part. And just to reiterate some passages of the poem that might have gone by quickly, in Professor Clarke's words, "Kindled lightning of Caesar's smoking hulks, his marine-born 37th Legion, that melange of roaring bees, incinerated the great library, liquidating 40,000 scrolls. What a disaster. The destruction of the greatest library of the ancient world is a calamity." To quote the poem again, "Caesar's chronicled triumph, his capture of Alexandria, was a regression. To exterminate the library," we're in a library today, "to set parchments smoking robustly, pages blackening unrelentingly, enacted a masterpiece of immorality." This poem, however, doesn't leave us there. Lots of the poems before it do take us down into the hell of history and end. This poem does not stop there. It turns in its 7th and final part to affirm that words, even the words narrating destruction, are liberty. As sparks fly out of the burning library, so words fly out of history. In using these words, in finding language, we can practice liberty. Such constant history is our dispiriting inheritance, Professor Clarke writes. But words still throng into song, thrive, and thus meet eternity alive. And you can hear the rhymes in that key stanza, underscoring the intelligent design, the traces of hope. Words still throng into song. The poem then also distinguishes itself by calling out 3 poets for praise. Dante, English-Canadian poet Irving Layton, the Quebecois poet Pierre Desruisseaux. And it culminates with this metaphor that words, sparks of enlightenment, bright motes of freedom, fly up out of the inferno of history. Dante's glittering ink, par exemple, or Layton's crowing lungs, or Desruisseaux's plumes of letters, all arrive as impudent sparks, or as the lighthouse beams that silver the wrecks of vainglorious tyrants and the seaweed graves of sunken assassins and arsonists, to tell us liberty is priceless, not gold, that a poet enters a pantheon of equals, that their great strumming is fire that never dies down, that encumbers otherwise unencumbered darkness. So I tell you all that just to say that for me, that's where you hooked me. That's where you hooked me. And And I'd just like to thank you again. And if you want to respond, or if anyone else has questions for our last 5 minutes, please feel free. And then I'll call on Chris Lyons to come up and conclude our remarks.
Thank you. Wow, fantastic. I need to ask for a round of applause for our panelists.